you can do a lot of things in 30 minutes, like watching your favorite TV show, cooking a sumptuous meal, reading a good book, or driving across town. But those things didn't interest Christa Pike, who spent 30 minutes torturing her classmate to death while the victim begged for her life. Pike didn't stop until she crushed the victim's skull, laughed, and kept a piece of it as a souvenir. She was just 18 years old, but became the youngest woman to be sentenced to death in America. By September 30th, 2026, she will be executed. But the real question is, how did a teenage girl turn into the most aggressive killer Tennessee has seen in 200 years? Keep watching to find out how this story unfolds. Some children are born into chaos, and Christa Gail Pike was one of them. She arrived too early, premature, fragile, and already fighting just to breathe. The date was March 10th, 1976, and the place was Beckley, West Virginia, a small city nestled in coal country where opportunities were scarce and hope even scarcer. Her mother, Carissa Hansen, and her father, Emil Glenn Pike, weren't ready for a baby. They weren't ready for each other either, but that didn't stop them from trying. Their relationship played out like a pattern set on repeat. 2 years married, 1 year divorced after Carissa was caught cheating. Then 2 more years remarried after Carissa attempted suicide. 4 years total of marriage, but the damage lasted far longer than that. From the very beginning, neglect wrapped around Christa like a blanket she couldn't throw off. An aunt who visited the home later testified about what she saw. Baby Christa crawling through piles of dog feces scattered across the floor, while Carissa continued her lifestyle of partying and carousing. Even after doctors told Carissa that her toddler was experiencing severe seizures, the mother didn't change. The bars and the men mattered more than the convulsing child at home. The only person who seemed to care was Christa's paternal grandmother. She stepped in when no one else would, helping to care for the little girl who so desperately needed someone to love her. Christa believed this woman was the only one who ever truly did. Years later, she would say her grandmother was the only light in a childhood filled with darkness. But even that light didn't last. School should have been an escape, but for Christa, it became another reminder of how different she was. She had been intelligent as a young child, curious and capable, but her chaotic home life meant she changed schools constantly. Each move stripped away a little more of her potential, and her grades began to suffer. Teachers noticed something was wrong, but no one intervened in a way that mattered. When Christa was in 3rd grade, she swallowed a bottle of acetaminophen, a suicide attempt at 8 or 9 years old. After that, she received psychiatric treatment, followed by psychological care and therapy at different times throughout her childhood. But nothing stuck. The system touched her life briefly, then moved on, leaving her to navigate the wreckage alone. In 1988, when Christa was 12 years old, her grandmother died. The only person who had ever shown her consistent love was gone. And Christa tried to follow her. She attempted suicide again, and this time she received almost no support at all. The adults around her seemed to accept that this was just who Christa was: troubled, damaged, destined for nothing good. Violence became the language Christa spoke when words failed. Her teenage years were marked by instability, rage, and a growing sense that she didn't belong anywhere. She lived with her mother, then with her father, then back with her mother again, each move bringing new conflicts and new wounds. One of Carissa's boyfriends punched Christa in the face after she chased him with a butter knife. Criminal charges were filed, then quietly settled. When she stayed with her father's new family, one of her young half-sisters claimed Christa had molested her. Emil didn't ask questions. He just kicked Christa out, sending her back to Carissa's home, where chaos continued to reign. Throughout these years, Christa claimed she had been sexually assaulted or molested at several points in her life. Her friends and family doubted these stories. They called her a pathological liar, someone who manipulated the truth to fit whatever narrative suited her in the moment. Whether the abuse happened or not, those around Christa stopped believing her. Trust became another thing she couldn't hold on to. In one incident that seemed to sum up the violence swirling around her, a man called Carissa's house and said he was going to rape her. Christa and a friend found the man in a parking lot and beat him with a stick. Violence for violence. It was the only justice Christa seemed to understand. By the time she reached 10th grade, the system had seen enough. Christa was sent to a juvenile facility for a year, locked away from the world she had never quite fit into. But even in detention, something shifted. She learned about the Job Corps, a government program aimed at helping low-income youth by offering vocational training and career skills. For the first time in her life, Christa talked about a future. She completed her GED while in the facility and told people she wanted to become a nursing assistant. Maybe this was her chance. Maybe she could leave West Virginia and its memories behind. Start fresh in a new place where no one knew about the dog feces or the suicide attempts or the violence. Maybe she could be someone different. In late 1994, at 18 years old, Christa Pike arrived at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. The center sat on Dale Avenue, not far from the University of Tennessee campus, and it buzzed with young people all trying to build something better than what they'd left behind. Christa enrolled in the program and started attending classes. For a few months, it seemed like the fresh start might actually work. Then she met Tadaryl Shipp. Tadaryl was 17, 1 year younger than Christa, and he was everything she thought she needed. He was intense, dark, fascinated by things that existed on the edges of what most people considered acceptable. They started dating quickly, and their relationship became the center of both their worlds. Together, they developed an interest in the occult and devil worship, reading about pentagrams and blood sacrifices and the power that supposedly came from embracing darkness. They fed off each other's fascination. What began as curiosity deepened into obsession, and what was once just talk started to sound more and more like a plan. They carved pentagrams into their skin. They talked about rituals. They imagined what it would feel like to hold life and death in their hands. Then Colleen Slemmer arrived at the Job Corps Center, and Christa's jealousy found a target. Colleen Ann Slemmer was born on September 20th, 1975 in Florida. She grew up in Orange Park with her mother, May Martinez, her stepfather, and her younger sister. They weren't wealthy, far from it, but they loved each other, and that counted for something. Colleen was 19 years old when she enrolled in the Job Corps program in September 1994, just a few months before Christa arrived. She had dreams of working with computers. In 1994, computer technology was booming, and anyone who mastered it had a promising future ahead. Colleen couldn't afford college, but the Job Corps gave her a chance to learn the skills that might lift her out of poverty. She was enthusiastic, pretty, focused on building something better. She had only been at the center for 3 months when Christa Pike decided she was a threat. Christa became convinced that Colleen was trying to steal Tadaryl from her. She saw the way Colleen smiled, the way she talked to other students, the way she existed in the same space as Tadaryl. In Christa's mind, Colleen was flirting with him, making moves, trying to take away the one person who made Christa feel like she mattered. Friends of Colleen denied this completely. They said Colleen had no romantic interest in Tadaryl, that she barely knew him, that Christa's jealousy was unfounded and irrational. But jealousy doesn't care about facts. It grows in the dark spaces of the mind, feeding on insecurity and fear, until it becomes something monstrous. Christa started planning. She recruited another student, 18-year-old Tadaryl Peterson, to help her. Tadaryl was eager to be included, eager to be part of something that felt important and dangerous. The plan was simple at first. They would lure Colleen to an isolated spot, scare her, make sure she knew to stay away from Tadaryl. Just a warning, just enough to put the fear into her. But as the days passed, the plan grew darker. Christa talked about teaching Colleen a lesson she'd never forget. She talked about making her pay for trying to steal what belonged to Christa. The language shifted from a prank to something else entirely. Something Tadaryl should have recognized as dangerous, but didn't. Or maybe she did recognize it. Maybe she just didn't care enough to stop it. On January 12, 1995, the temperature in Knoxville hovered in the mid-40s. The sun set early, beaming its light across the Job Corps Center as students finished their classes and headed back to the dormitory. It was a Friday night, and most of the students were looking forward to the weekend. Colleen Slemmer had no idea that this would be the last night of her life. Around 8:00 p.m., Christa Pike approached Colleen in the dormitory. She was friendly, almost apologetic. She said she wanted to make peace, that she was tired of the tension between them. She suggested they all go for a walk together. Christa, Tadaryl, Tadaryl, and Colleen, to a spot in the woods where they could smoke marijuana and talk things through. Colleen agreed. She wanted the conflict to end, wanted things to be normal again. She signed out of the dormitory along with Christa, Tadaryl, and Tadaryl. The logbook recorded all four of them leaving at 8:15 p.m. They walked toward the abandoned steam plant near the University of Tennessee Agricultural Campus. The area was isolated, surrounded by trees and darkness. Most students avoided it at night because there were no lights, no witnesses, or any help if something went wrong. It was the perfect place for what Christa had planned. They walked for about 20 minutes, the four of them talking casually, as if this were just another night. Colleen had no reason to suspect anything. Christa had been friendly, Tadaryl was quiet, and Tadaryl chatty. Everything seemed fine. Until they reached the secluded spot behind the steam plant. Christa gave Tadaryl a look. Tadaryl moved to the edge of the clearing to act as lookout. Then Christa turned to Colleen and said something later. No one could remember exactly what she said, and everything changed in an instant. Christa and Tadaryl attacked Colleen simultaneously. They punched her, kicked her, knocked her to the ground. Colleen screamed for help, but there was no one to hear her. The abandoned steam plant swallowed her cries, and the trees stood silent as witnesses. For the next 30 minutes, Colleen Slemmer endured torture. They beat her with their fists. They slashed at her with a box cutter, carving lines into her skin. Christa pulled out a knife and began cutting a pentagram into Colleen's chest while Tadaryl held her down. Colleen begged them to stop. She cried. She pleaded for her life. She asked why they were doing this, what she had done to deserve it. Christa laughed. She taunted Colleen, told her this was what happened to girls who tried to steal other people's boyfriends. She told her she was going to die here, alone, and no one would care. The pentagram wasn't enough. The slashes weren't enough. The beating wasn't enough. Christa's rage demanded more. She picked up a large chunk of asphalt, the kind used for paving roads, heavy and rough. She raised it above her head and brought it down on Colleen's skull. The first blow fractured bone. The second one crushed it. She hit Colleen again and again, long after Colleen had stopped screaming, long after she had stopped moving, long after she was clearly dead. When it was finally over, Christa stood over Colleen's body, breathing hard, covered in blood. Then she did something that would haunt investigators for decades. She reached down and plucked a piece of bone from the left side of Colleen's shattered skull. She held it up to the moonlight, examining it like a prize. She put the piece of skull in her jacket pocket and walked away. Tadaryl and Shadola followed her back toward the Job Corps Center. They signed back in at 10:45 p.m. The logbook showed that 4 people had left together, but only 3 returned. Colleen Slemmer was still lying behind the steam plant, her body broken, her blood soaking into the cold Tennessee ground. The next morning, a groundskeeper discovered a badly mangled body in the woods. The scene was so horrific, it was initially mistaken for an animal carcass. Investigators arrived and slowly started piecing together what had happened. They saw the slashes, the carved pentagram, the crushed skull. They saw what remained of a 19-year-old girl who had only wanted to learn computer skills so she could build a better life. If you think Colleen might have read the warning signs, but ignored them, let me know below. What would you have done if you'd seen the warning signs? Knoxville Police Department detectives arrived at the scene within the hour. Lead investigator Randy York later said it was one of the most brutal crime scenes he had ever witnessed. The violence was excessive, personal, ritualistic. This wasn't a random killing. Someone had wanted Colleen to suffer. Detectives quickly focused on the Job Corps Center. They checked the dormitory logbook and saw that Colleen had signed out the previous night with 3 other students, Christa Gail Pike, Tadaryl Shipp, and Shadola Peterson. Only the other 3 had signed back in. Police brought all 3 in for questioning. Shadola broke almost immediately. She told detectives about the plan, the lies they'd told Colleen, the walk to the steam plant. She described how Christa and Tadaryl had attacked while she stood watch. She said she was scared, that she didn't think it would go that far, that she just wanted to leave. Tadaryl stayed mostly silent during his interrogation, but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't deny being there. He didn't express remorse. He just sat quietly, occasionally glancing at the door as if wondering when he could leave. Christa was different. She talked freely, almost proudly. She admitted to the torture and killing, but insisted they were merely trying to scare Colleen and had got out of control. She described the beating in detail, the pentagram, and the asphalt. She didn't cry, apologize, or speak about Colleen's death the way someone might describe a movie they'd watched. Then detectives searched Christa's jacket. In the pocket, they found the piece of Colleen's skull. Christa had made no clear efforts at concealing what she did. Details of the killing emerged after Pike confided in a fellow student named Kim Iloilo about her gruesome act. According to court records, Iloilo's testimony revealed that Pike had told her the day before the crime that she planned to murder a classmate simply because she just felt mean. In 1998, Iloilo recounted to the Tennessee Supreme Court what Pike had shared with her upon returning to campus following the killing. Pike came to Iloilo's room and confessed she had just murdered Slemmer, bringing back a fragment of the victim's skull as a keepsake, the testimony stated. Pike displayed the skull fragment and described how she had slashed the victim's throat 6 times, attacked her physically, and hurled asphalt at her head. Pike explained to Iloilo that the victim had pleaded with them to stop the cutting and beating, but Pike refused to stop because the victim kept speaking. Pike recounted throwing a large chunk of asphalt at the victim's head, and when it shattered into smaller fragments, Pike revealed that a meat cleaver had been used on the victim's back, while a box cutter was used on her throat. She concluded by saying a pentagram had been etched into the victim's forehead and chest. According to Iloilo, Pike was spinning around, grinning and chanting, "La, la, la," as she recounted these horrifying details. The following morning at breakfast, Iloilo asked Pike about the skull fragment's whereabouts. Pike responded that she had it in her pocket, then added, "And yes, I'm eating breakfast with it." Within 36 hours of the murder, All 3 suspects were arrested. Christa Gail Pike, Tadaryl Shipp, and Shadala Peterson. They were charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The state of Tennessee announced they would seek the death penalty for Christa Pike. For Tadaryl Shipp, who had turned 17 just 2 months before the murder, they would seek life without parole. Shadala Peterson made a deal. She agreed to testify against Christa and Tadaryl in exchange for leniency. She would plead guilty to being an accessory after the fact and receive 6 years of probation. No prison time, just probation, community service, and the knowledge that she had stood watch while Colleen Slemmer was tortured to death. May Martinez, Colleen's mother, was devastated. She had sent her daughter to the Job Corps Center believing it was a safe place, a chance for a better future. Instead, she got a phone call from Florida police telling her that Colleen was dead, murdered by her classmates, her skull crushed, and a piece of it kept as a trophy. May wanted justice and answers. She wanted to understand how this could happen, how 3 teenagers could plan and execute such brutal violence. But most of all, she wanted the piece of her daughter's skull back so she could bury Colleen whole. The state refused. They said the skull fragment was evidence and would remain in their possession as long as the case was open and as long as Christa Pike was alive. May would have to wait for justice before she could have that final piece of her daughter back. Christa Pike's trial began in early 1996 in Knox County Criminal Court. The prosecution team was led by assistant district attorneys who knew they had a strong case. The evidence was overwhelming. Christa's confession, the piece of skull in her pocket, Shadola's testimony, the brutality of the crime scene, and the fact that Christa had bragged about the murder to other students. The defense team faced an impossible task. How do you defend someone who confessed, kept a piece of the victim's skull, and showed no remorse? Their strategy focused on Christa's troubled childhood, her history of abuse and neglect, her mental health struggles. They argued that Christa was a product of her environment, that years of trauma had damaged her ability to control her impulses. They brought in psychologists who testified about Christa's borderline personality disorder, her depression, her difficulty forming healthy attachments. They talked about the dog feces she crawled through as a baby, the sexual abuse she claimed to have suffered, the suicide attempts, the violence she witnessed and perpetrated throughout her childhood. The prosecution countered with the facts of the crime itself. They presented photographs of Colleen's body, such as the carved pentagram, the crushed skull, the defensive wounds on her hands where she had tried to protect herself. They played audio of Christa's confession, where she described the murder with a disturbing detachment to empathy. They called Shadala Peterson to the stand, and she described in detail how Christa and Tadaryl had tortured Colleen for 30 minutes while she begged for her life. Randy York, the lead investigator, testified about finding the skull fragment in Christa's jacket pocket. He described how Christa had shown no emotion during questioning, how she had spoken about Colleen's death as if it were nothing more significant than a homework assignment. The jury heard testimony from other Job Corps students who said Christa had bragged about the murder. One student testified that Christa had shown her the piece of skull and laughed when describing how Colleen had begged for her life. The defense tried to paint Christa as a damaged teenager who had snapped under the weight of her trauma. They argued that she had been manipulated by Tadaryl, that her obsession with the occult had clouded her judgment, that she didn't fully understand the consequences of her actions. But the prosecution had a simple response, a premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. Christa had planned it. She had recruited Shadala. She had lured Colleen to an isolated location under false pretenses. She had tortured her for 30 minutes. She had kept a piece of her skull as a trophy. Every action showed her deliberation, intent, and complete disregard for human life. On March 22, 1996, after only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty on both counts, first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. 8 days later, the sentencing phase began. The jury had to decide whether Christa Pike would spend the rest of her life in prison or be sentenced to death. The prosecution argued that the crime met the standards for capital punishment because it was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The defense pleaded for life in prison. They argued that Christa was only 18 years old at the time of the murder, that she had a terrible childhood, that she suffered from mental illness. They said death was too severe, that life in prison would be punishment enough. The jury disagreed. On March 30, 1996, they sentenced Christa Gail Pike to death by electrocution for the murder of Colleen Slemmer, plus 25 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Christa Pike, at 20 years old, became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States during the post-Furman period, the era after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Don't forget to drop a comment. I would like to know what you think about this case so far. You can also drop a like if you think Christa Gail Pike deserves her sentencing. Tadaryl Shipp's trial took place in January 1997. His defense team argued that he had been under Christa's influence, that she had been the driving force behind the murder. But the evidence showed that Tadaryl had participated willingly. He had helped hold Colleen down and had participated in the torture. He also never tried to help her while she was tortured. The jury found him guilty on both counts. During the sentencing phase, they couldn't unanimously agree whether he deserved life without parole, so the judge made the decision. He sentenced Tadaryl to life in prison with the possibility of parole, plus a consecutive 25-year sentence for conspiracy. The judge called Tadaryl a dangerous individual and structured the sentence to ensure he wouldn't be eligible for parole until he was in his late 40s or early 50s. Shadala Peterson served her 6 years of probation and then disappeared from public view. She changed her name, moved away from Tennessee, and built a life far from the murder that had defined her teenage years. She never served a day in prison for her role as lookout during Colleen's torture and death. Christa Pike was transferred to Tennessee's death row at the Tennessee Prison for Women in Nashville. She became the only woman on the state's death row, living in conditions close to solitary confinement. Her cell was small, isolated, and watched constantly. She had limited contact with other inmates and spent most of her time alone with her thoughts. But if anyone expected Christa to reflect on what she'd done, to show remorse, or to change, they were disappointed. She launched appeals, then canceled them, then launched them again. In June 2001, and again in June 2002, she asked the courts to drop her appeal and execute her via electrocution. A judge granted the request and set an execution date of August 19, 2002. Then, just weeks before the scheduled execution, Christa changed her mind again. On July 8, 2002, her defense lawyers filed a motion to allow the appeal process to continue. The lower court denied the motion, but a 3-judge state appeals court panel ruled that the proceedings should be continued. The execution was stopped. For May Martinez, this was another cruel twist in a case that had already taken everything from her. She wanted justice. She wanted the piece of her daughter's skull back. She wanted Christa Pike to face the consequences of what she'd done. Instead, she watched as Christa manipulated the system, changing her mind about wanting to die, playing games with the courts, while Colleen remained buried without all of her body parts. In December 2008, Pike's latest request for a new trial was turned down, and she was returned to death row. With this denial, Pike's allowed appeals under the rules and procedures of Tennessee's criminal justice system were exhausted. But Christa wasn't done causing harm. On August 24, 2001, While Pike was housed on death row, she attacked a fellow inmate named Patricia Jones. With alleged assistance from another prisoner named Natasha Cornett, Pike tried to strangle Jones with a shoestring. She wrapped it around Jones's neck and pulled tight, trying to choke the life out of her. Jones had been serving a life sentence for murdering an 84-year-old woman named Alberta Coker in Knoxville. She was no saint, but she didn't deserve to be strangled in her prison cell. Officers intervened before Pike could finish what she'd started, but Jones came terrifyingly close to death. Pike was convicted of attempted first-degree murder in August 2004 and received an additional 25-year sentence. Tennessee Department of Corrections investigators believed Natasha Cornett had helped, but they concluded there wasn't enough evidence to charge her. The attack revealed a chilling fact that Christa Pike was still dangerous, violent, and still capable of trying to kill. Being on death row hadn't changed her. Facing execution hadn't reformed her. She was the same person who had tortured Colleen Slemmer to death, and she likely always would be. In 2011, Christa Pike began exchanging letters with a man named Donald Kohut from New Jersey. Kohut was in his early 30s, working as a personal trainer in Flemington. He had somehow learned about Christa's case and decided to reach out. What began as a casual correspondence quickly became something more. By July 2011, Kohut was making the nearly 1,700-mile round trip from New Jersey to Nashville once or twice a month to visit Pike on visiting days. He fell for her completely. She was charismatic in her letters, vulnerable in a way that made him want to save her. She knew exactly what to say to make him believe she was more than just a murderer on death row. Kohut started planning her escape. He recruited a corrections officer named Justin Heflin, who agreed to help in exchange for cash and gifts. The plan involved tracing a prison key and creating a duplicate that would allow Pike to move freely through areas that should have been locked. The details were never fully disclosed. Security concerns kept much of the plan classified. But Tennessee Department of Corrections investigators later said the plot wasn't far along when they discovered it. In early 2012, prison personnel received information about the escape plot. A joint investigation involving the Tennessee Department of Corrections, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and the New Jersey State Police shut it down before it could proceed. Kohut was arrested in March 2012 and charged with bribery and conspiracy to commit escape. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison to be served at the Tennessee State Northeast Correctional Complex. Heflin was also arrested and charged with bribery, official misconduct, and conspiracy to commit escape. He cooperated with authorities, served no prison time, but was terminated from his job. Pike was not charged. Investigators couldn't prove she had actively participated in planning the escape, though it seemed obvious she was aware of it. Once again, she had manipulated someone into trying to help her escape the consequences of her actions. Subscribe if you believe justice shouldn't take 30 years while families suffer in limbo. You can also drop a like if you think Pike is a master of tricks. Over the years, Pike's lawyers filed multiple federal appeals. In May 2014, they entered an appeal arguing that Pike had received ineffective assistance of counsel, that she suffered from mental illness, and that capital punishment as administered in Tennessee was unconstitutional. On March 11, 2016, U.S. District Judge Harry Sandlin Mattis, Jr. issued a 61-page ruling rejecting all grounds and denying the requested commutation. The ruling was thorough and unambiguous. Pike had received a fair trial. Her mental illness didn't excuse the brutality of her crime, and Tennessee's death penalty procedures were constitutional. Pike's lawyers appealed to the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. On August 22, 2019, after hearing arguments on October 1, 2018, a 3-judge panel unanimously upheld the lower court ruling and denied relief. In 2023, Pike's lawyers tried again. In November 2022, the Tennessee Supreme Court had ruled that the state's law for juveniles automatically sentenced to life without parole was unconstitutional. Pike's lawyers argued that her young age and damaged mental health at the time of the killing should spare her from execution. They pointed to the same ruling and claimed it should apply to her. In October 2023, Knox County Criminal Court Judge Scott Green denied the request. He noted that the ruling applied only to juvenile offenders, those under 18. Pike had been legally an adult when she murdered Colleen Slemmer. The law was clear, and Pike didn't meet the criteria. Every appeal failed. Every attempt to avoid execution was denied. The courts repeatedly found that Pike had received fair trials, that her actions warranted the death penalty, and that no constitutional violations had occurred. On September 30th, 2025, the Tennessee Supreme Court finally issued a death warrant for Christa Gail Pike. Her execution was scheduled for September 30th, 2026, exactly 1 year later. If Pike is executed, she will be the first woman put to death in Tennessee in roughly 200 years. She will also be the first teenage offender Tennessee has executed in the modern era, though she was legally an adult at the time of her crime. The announcement sent shockwaves through both supporters and opponents of the death penalty. Pike's attorneys issued a statement saying, "Christa's childhood was fraught with years of physical and sexual abuse and neglect. With time and treatment, she has become a thoughtful woman with deep remorse for her crime." But Mae Martinez, Colleen's mother, saw it differently. She told reporters, "I've got to fight for Colleen. I'm her voice." After decades of waiting, she finally had a date, a moment when justice might be served, when the state would hold Christa Pike accountable for the 30 minutes of torture that ended her daughter's life. Randy York, the lead investigator who had interviewed Pike after the murder, still keeps in touch with Mae. He said, "The passage of time can't erase what happened. Colleen was brutally murdered, and someone needs to answer for that." Colleen Slemmer never got a second chance. She never got to finish her computer training program at the Job Corps Center. She never got to build the career she dreamed about, never got to fall in love, get married, have children, or grow old. She died at 19 years old, tortured by people she thought were her friends, had her skull crushed by a chunk of asphalt, and her body left behind an abandoned steam plant. And for decades, a piece of her skull remained in the possession of the Tennessee criminal justice system as an exhibit in a case that refused to close, a trophy Christa Pike had taken that Mae Martinez desperately wanted back so she could bury her daughter whole. The murder of Colleen Slemmer has been featured on numerous television shows, such as Deadly Women, For My Man, Killer Kids, Martinis and Murder, Snapped, Killer Couples, and Mean Girl Murders. It's been covered in documentaries, podcasts, and true crime specials. Author Patricia Springer wrote a book about the case called A Love to Die For. But no TV show can change what happened. No book can bring Colleen back. No podcast can erase the 30 minutes she spent begging for her life, while Christa Pike laughed and Tadaryl Shipp held her down, and Shadola Peterson stood watch. Christa Pike sits on death row in Tennessee, waiting for September 30th, 2026. She's 49 years old now, no longer the 18-year-old who carved a pentagram into a classmate's chest. She spent more than half her life behind bars, most of it in isolation, most of it knowing that one day the state would execute her. Her lawyers continue to fight. They file motions, make arguments, search for any legal avenue that might save her life. They talk about her troubled childhood, her mental illness, her capacity for change. They argue that executing her would serve no purpose, that she's no longer a threat, that she deserves mercy. But Mae Martinez doesn't talk about mercy. She talks about her 19-year-old daughter who was tortured for 30 minutes by people she knew and had a pentagram carved into her chest without even knowing what she did wrong to earn such a horrible fate. She talks about a piece of her daughter's skull that Christa Pike kept as a trophy. She talks about 31 years of waiting for justice. She talks about wanting to bury her daughter whole. And here's the part that should haunt you. That piece of Colleen's skull? The state still has it, locked away in an evidence room somewhere in Tennessee. May Martinez has begged for it back for 3 decades. She wants to finally lay her daughter to rest, completely. But she can't. Not while Christa Pike is still breathing. On January 12, 1995, Colleen Slemmer made a choice that cost her everything. She trusted the wrong people. She believed in second chances. She thought the tension between her and Christa could be resolved with a conversation and some weed. September 30th, 2026. That's the date. That's when this finally ends. Maybe, though. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that Christa Pike is a fighter. She has dodged death before and manipulated the system for 31 years. She has changed her mind about dying and even tried to escape from prison. The question isn't whether she deserves to die. The courts answered that in 1996. The question is, will Tennessee actually follow through? Or will Christa Pike find one more loophole, one more appeal, one more way to cheat justice while May Martinez grows older, still waiting, fighting, and unable to bury her daughter whole? If you believe 31 years is long enough, I would like you to do 3 things for justice to prevail, like this video. Tell me which country you are watching from, and also drop "Justice for Colleen" in the comments section. Let May know the world hasn't forgotten her daughter.
I want to thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love what's coming next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for instant updates on our latest videos. See you in the next one.